Good evening and welcome to Q&A live from the grand studio of our partners at Metro TV News, Jakarta. I'm Tony Jones and answering your questions tonight. Yenny Wahid, the daughter of the former Indonesian President Gus Dur and director of the Wahid Institute for Religious Tolerance. The editor-in-chief of the Jakarta Post, Meidyatama, Suryodiningrat, also known as Dimas. The senior advisor to the Indonesian Vice President, Dewi Fortuna Anwar. The deputy editor-in-chief of Tempo magazine, Yuli Ismartono. Indonesia's representative on the ASEAN Human Rights Commission, Rafendi Djamin, and Tim Lindsey, the director of the Centre for Indonesian Law, Islam and Society at Melbourne University. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Tonight we are being simulcast on ABC News 24, the Australia Network and News Radio, and streamed from the Q&A and Australia Network websites. And you can join the Twitter conversation as usual with the hashtag that just appeared on your screen. Well, as the Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd flies into Jakarta to meet President Boediono, we're joined by an audience of Australians and Indonesians to ask the questions. Our first question tonight comes from Beatty.
Australians' expectations of what Indonesia can do are unreasonable. What my question is, what Australia has put into policy in order to stop people smuggling without insisting Indonesia to put it into policy? Thank you.
Dewi, Fortuna, Anwar, are Australia's expectations of what Indonesia can do on people smuggling unreasonable?
Well, I've been saying that actually, Tony, because while I understand the concerns that all of us are very concerned, especially about the tragedies, the sinking of ships and so many deaths and so on, and clearly this have to be stopped. And we have to admit that Indonesia and Australia are both victims of this because most of these people come from outside of the region. But to expect Indonesia to be able to stop every port in the we have over 17,000 islands, various small fishing ports and everything, and which are very poorly guarded. With our poor capacity and the resources are very stretched, very thin, I think it is rather unreasonable to be able, to expect Indonesia to do as much as some people in Australia expected.
Would it be reasonable to ask Indonesia to do something about the police corruption that is sometimes behind the people smuggling and the access they're getting to ports and boats?
Let me say that one of the issues that Indonesia faces is corruption. Corruption is systemic, endemic, and it is really the bane of our country's life. This is one of the major agenda of our democratic reform, and we are seriously trying to have zero tolerance towards corruption. But we have to be the first to admit that corruption still happens, and whether it is aiding people smuggling, whether it's drug trafficking, whether it is just overall briberies, corruption does happen. And when we have to be able to separate that, the Indonesian government is trying seriously to tackle with corruption, but the problems that we face is enormous. And I don't think we should condone corrupt police who are taking bribes, because especially that lead to deaths of so many people. But the fact of the matter is that, this is not something that the state will condone.
Dimas, what do you say about the original question, whether Australia has unreasonable expectations of Indonesia?
I think expectations, whether Indonesia or Australia, are always unreasonable most of the time. But I think it's...
Why do you think that is, by the way?
It's life, isn't it? But I think that in terms of perspective, you have to look at it two ways. One, Australia is a destination country. Indonesia is a transit country. So in that way, we look at things very differently. And the point that you have to remember is that Indonesia is only the last transit point. It's a bit like fighting a network of mafia, in which you don't stop it at the transit point, you stop it at the source. Even if Indonesian police were the most cleanest and best in the world, I don't think it would stop the boat people from coming to Australia. The prize is Australia. Even though there are 10,000 boat people in Indonesia, they still want to go to Australia. They don't want to go to Indonesia. They don't want to stop in Malaysia. So it is Australia. So it's about working together as a regional problem, stopping it at the source. Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, that's where you have to stop it.
There have been reports in Australian newspapers that Kevin Rudd may come here with an offer to actually set up and pay for a processing centre so that Indonesia is no longer a transit country, but a place where refugees are processed. Would you agree with that, or asylum seekers?
There is already a processing centre south of Jakarta in Cisarua run by the United Nations Commission on Refugees. There's already a processing centre set up by the International Migration Office. One of the problems there is that the refugees there, or the asylum seekers there, wait for 3 years, 4 years, and they get bored of waiting, and they go to people smugglers. They pay people to go to Australia. So I don't necessarily think that is the solution, per se. I mean, it's just a continuation. And to push it another way, I think it's very dangerous to put the issue of people smuggling, which is really an Australian domestic agenda in the face of coming elections, as a top-tier issue in terms of the bilateral relationship.
Well, let's give you a bit of an indication. I'll come to the rest of the panel after this as to why it's such a big issue in Australia. Our next question is a video. It's from John Rogers in Cremorne, New South Wales.
It is clear that the boats arriving from Indonesia are owned by Indonesians, crewed by Indonesians, and a lot of people in authority in Indonesia are making serious money from our refugee crisis. Little wonder then there is no incentive to stop it. Is it time for the PM to tell Jakarta that we need to drastically reduce our aid budget to that country in order for us to pay for the processing, settlement or deportation of the boat arrivals that freely leave that country? No more kowtowing, please, Mr. Rudd.
Yuli, Ismartono, I mean, you hear the anger in that, and that's what Australian politicians face. What do you, I mean, you've been to Australia many times. What do you think when you hear that kind of argument being made?
Well, I wonder if Australians understand that the problem of refugees happen mostly in coastal areas, one of the poorest areas in Indonesia. And here they are, burdened by all this refugee influx. The authorities have to deal with arresting them, putting in cells, feeding them. And, you know, it's like Dewi said, it's more than we can do. Now, I see the problem. Corruption is one of them, maybe, but he should understand it's also poverty. People who are poor in the coastal areas are tempted to offer their boats. So what do? I see perhaps a regional, if you really expand it, since a lot of countries are involved, to do something like empowering the people who are touched or affected by it.
Do you think the Indonesian government gets how passionate this discussion and debate has gotten in Australia? And I'll just add one more thing. The other side of politics is talking about stopping the boats at sea and turning them back towards Indonesia. Would that be acceptable?
Not at all. I don't think the Indonesians would like that at all. They'd probably push them back to Australia. You know, I mean, again, it's not our problem. We are just a transit country. We have sympathy for those people. But, you know, we are also burdened. Why can't they have processing centers in the coasts of Australia? You ever think about that?
Yeah.
What Yuli says is really putting the finger on the point of similarity that's the problem in this. Both countries agree that neither of them want the asylum seekers. Indonesia considers it to be Australia's problem as the destination country. Australia considers it to be Indonesia's problem as the transit country. Neither of them want it. Both think it's the other one's problem. The boats may well be pushed backwards and forwards. That's effectively what's happening in terms of responsibility. That's why there needs to be some sort of comprehensive regional solution like there was for the Indo-Chinese refugees in the 90s. That's what's going to have to happen, with Indonesia front and centre in it. Otherwise, we're just going to get into this pushing the blame backwards and forwards. Third order issue here, but...
Rafendi, can I ask you, what do you think?
I try to only jump in, but, you know, wait.
Yeah, I'm giving you an opportunity. Well, jump in, go ahead.
What is the underlying issue, you know? People seem to forget both sides, Australia or Indonesia. We have similarity. You said there's a different perspective, but we have similarity, Dimas. Is this a question of border protection or human protection? Is it a border protection or human rights protection? It's a choice that you have to make. And if descriptions of the politician about the flux of this people smuggling, when you think about the fact, the land border in Syria, when there's a crisis of refugee, 1.7 million people take refuge to the neighboring country, 1.7. And what we're talking about now between Australia, Indonesia and Australia is less than 10,000, probably in a year.
Except, can
what are we talking about? Are we protecting the border or are we protecting the human?
Can I just make the point, this point would be made by Australian politicians and many other people in Australia as well, that a lot of people are getting on those boats. It's a very dangerous form of transport. They're going across dangerous stretches of sea and they're getting caught and drowning. Large numbers of people are drowning. So what about their protection?
Sure, we are talking about the same language now, protection. That language is supposed to be the priority of both sides. There is a regional effort now. We have a Bali process, okay? And then there is already an attempt to do some cooperation between two countries. But the main approach is still the law enforcement. It's not, the notion of protection is more a rhetoric. The thing that you're saying is rhetoric. But in practice, what is becoming a policy is creating a detention center, giving money to Indonesian immigration office to create a detention center. That's not the solution. That's not the human approach protection. It's more law enforcement protection.
Okay, let's hear from Yenny. I'll bring you in a second. I just want to hear from Yenny. We haven't heard from her yet. What do you? I mean, you know Australia very well as well. You'd be well aware of this debate and how passionate it is, and the election context.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid that all these debates about the asylum seekers just foders for political consumption, domestic political consumption in Australia, and that we're missing the bigger point here, which is to find a substantive solution which is realistic and humane as well. You know, we can't just turn people away and turn the boat away and hope that the problem will go away. I mean, it's not very realistic approach. I mean, there's a protocol in the sea in which if there are people in distress out in the sea, then navies, anyone who happens to meet them will have to help them. Things like that will have to be taken into perspective. So I think we have to avoid that. We have to, get this again. What's being said about finding a regional solutions is the better approach. And don't forget, there are other countries here that's also involved. There's Malaysia, for example, because these people are coming into Indonesia through Malaysia before they go to Australia. Going through Indonesia, but first they entered Southeast Asia through Malaysia because many people can enter Malaysia without any visa if they come from Muslim countries. So Malaysia doesn't allow people from Muslim countries to travel to Malaysia without visa. From there, they travel by bus to Indonesia, which is much easier. So there's a big problem, and we have to differentiate between criminal acts and government policy. What's happening is people smuggling is a criminal act. So what our approach should be how to handle this issue, not to impose on some unrealistic approach.
Yeah, let's hear from unrealistic, I think, or unreasonable was how the first question started, Dewi. So we have in Australia, as you've heard, you know very well, two very different views. The coalition, that is Tony Abbott's party, says they can turn back the boats and they will with Indonesian cooperation. Do you believe that will happen ever?
Never. No. But that is not the point. We are talking about.
It is the point. It is the point in Australian politics. I can assure you of that.
And I think that we are all during our silly seasons, and Australia seems to get sillier earlier than us. We are getting sillier from now until the next year. But I'd like to say that when we talk about the regional problems, that asking for regional solutions, we already have the Bali process. But in fact, this is not just regional problems. This is international problems. The fact of the matter is, it's very difficult to imagine that families will take the risk of death at seas and being abused throughout the way by sharks, by people, smugglers, and so on, if the push factor is not strong enough. I know that some Australian politicians talk about economic migrants, but people who are looking for...
Well, the Foreign Minister, Senator Carr, who was here recently, is the person who put that front and centre in the headlines. Do you say that's not true?
I would argue that people who are looking for simply better economic lives would rather like to live at the end of the day. If you want to improve your life, I doubt very much that they would actually go into a leaky boat and, with the possibility of sinking. It doesn't make sense. Usually the fear and the despair, I think there must be some despair factor. Because if you're just economic incentives. I come from West Sumatra, where most people go on merantau, migration. That's to make better lives. You don't put your life in danger in the process, if possible. So here, coming back, that this is an international problem, because most of those people who come through Indonesia to Australia come from the Middle East, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from countries that are really suffering. In the 70s, it came from Indochina. So I think that we need to move this issue beyond simply bilateral issues, and really also look at the source problems and stop, you know.
Very briefly, because a lot of people in Australia will want to know why you said never when I asked whether there would be an acceptance of a coalition government in the future turning back boats. I mean, you advised the Indonesian Vice President, if an Australian government were to do that, begin turning back boats, not in Indonesian territory, outside Indonesian territory, but turning them back towards Indonesia, what would you advise the government to do?
Well, not confrontation, as some people have mentioned lately, but clearly the Indonesian government would convey our concerns to the Australian government, because whether we disagree on approaches, the most important thing that we should not unnecessarily put people in danger. And to have people going back and forth in the boats and thinking, both Indonesia and Australia will look very, very bad. And I think that we should not allow ourselves to be so inhuman to do that kind of things.
Now, President Boediono has never actually said this in public.
Vice President Boediono was interviewed by ABC just a couple of weeks ago, and when he was asked this question, would Indonesia accept, you know, this kind of proposition? And he said, I don't think so.
Well, but yes, very mildly actually, but the coalition actually makes the point that he was answering a false question. They claim that he was asked what you would do if they did it inside Indonesian territory. Whereas they're saying they wouldn't, they would do it outside of Indonesian territory. So all you would be facing is boats coming back in your direction. Would the President, because he's going to do a press conference tomorrow, we imagine, with Kevin Rudd, is he likely to say this is unacceptable?
The Indonesian President will not allow himself to be trapped in the debates which are very much related to Australian politics. So Indonesia. So I think the most important thing for Indonesia is that regardless of who is in power in Australia, we value the friendship of Australia and the Australian people. And we like to be able to work closely with Australia regardless of who is in power. So I hope very much that Indonesia, Jakarta, doesn't get trapped, you know, into the debates.
Into taking sides.
Or into taking sides.
Okay.
So we will refrain. I'm sure that President Boediono is a very, very seasoned politician and diplomat, and I'm sure that he will be able to avoid this in a very Javanese way.
Okay. Thank you. I think the audience clearly understands what you mean by that. Let's move along. Our next question takes us more broadly into the issue of our relationship. It comes from Karina Akib.
Hi, I have two parts to my question. So the first part is, everybody says the relationship is important, but it seems like recently it hasn't gone back to the strong points during the heydays of the Keating era. I'd like to hear from the panel about why it would be important for younger generations to care about the relationship. And then the second part of the question is, actually, Dewi, in your paper, A Problem of Mixed Messages, you mentioned that the relationship is very asymmetrical. So, for example, Australians always portray the negative parts about Indonesia in the media, yet if you flick through the papers here, Australia rarely gets a mention in the papers here. So why do you think that is?
I won't start with Dewi on that because we've just interviewed you a little bit then, but I'd go to Yenny Wahid first. Are the Indonesian elites, is Indonesia generally disinterested in Australia and news from Australia?
No, we're just preoccupied with so many things on our table. You know, we've got the poverty issue, we've got the corruption issues, we've got so many things, you know, even you know, separatist issues, all sorts of issues that really just preoccupy our mind. And when it comes to neighbors, we've got a much more sort of sensitive spot that we give to Malaysia and Singapore, for example. So, you know, for us, Australia, it's a neighbor, you know, but except for, you know, the East Timor issue, and people don't really pay that much attention to what's going on in Australia.
Let's hear from Dimas on that.
Well, I think, Look, all politics is local the way all news is local, whether that you're Australian or you're Indonesian. I mean, that's the nature of news, that's the nature of people's attention. Physically, we're always taught to look front, up, and center. So it's only natural for Indonesians to look up, and then for Australians to also look up. We don't really look at what's behind us, do we?
I like the idea that we're down, it's because we're south.
So, I mean, that's part of it. Australia will grab attention when there is a change of leadership, if it has something to do with Kylie Minogue or AC/DC, for example. But
if it's a change of leadership, you have our attention quite a lot. Or we have your attention, I should say.
But then again, as I said, all politics is local. I think what Yenny pointed out was also very interesting. We have a lot more neighbors than you do. We've got Papua New Guinea to our right, we've got Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Brunei. So we've got a lot of things a lot of friends that are actually bordering on us. As compared to Australia, I mean, you have New Zealand, which you already think is part of Australia most of the time.
Now, don't get us wrong on that one.
So I think it's a physical, natural habit of the populations to look at it that way.
Dewi, is the relationship asymmetrical, as the questioner asks?
Well, my two colleagues here have already answered that, the natural way Australia looks north rather than to the South Pole or to the land of the happy land of the Kiwis. While we also have much bigger neighbors. Indonesia being part of ASEAN, ASEAN is of course, our primary concerns, but we also have concerns with China and Japan and Korea. But I'd like to get back to the question about that, whether the relationship between Australia and Indonesia have returned to the heyday of the Keating. The Keating period was romanticized because of this close relations between Prime Minister Keating and President Suharto at the time. I would argue that at the moment, Australia's relations are probably the best ever in terms of government-to-government relations. There are so many things going on and so many visits from leaders. So
many leaders to visit,
and
actually,
so many,
when you think about it.
Yeah, and so many leaders to visit. But what is different, qualitatively different, and also quantitatively different, is that the teaching about Indonesia in Australia used to be of higher priority to the Australian government and people during the 80s and early 90s than now. Now, it is really, really quite sad that the teaching of Indonesian language and so on is really going down. So at a time when Indonesia is moving very fast and there's some very, very fundamental changes that have taken place in Indonesia since 1998 and forward, Indonesia is becoming the third world largest democracy and so on. A lot of our friends in Australia apparently are not as well informed. I'm totally surprised and shocked and sad and appalled, actually, that's a very strong word, appalled to read the recent Lowy polling that said that only about 33% Australians believe that Indonesia is now a democracy and that they still view Indonesia as a military threat. They still believe probably that the military is ruling the country.
Or in fact that Bali is part of Indonesia.
That we already know that parts of Bali is part of Queensland. But this is, so there is a disjuncture between very close government-to-government relations, but there's something missing in the people-to-people relations.
Let's go to Tim. You've obviously watched this very closely, and I'm sure that you must feel quite strongly about what Dewi was just saying, particularly about the language issue, the teaching of Bahasa in Australia.
In fact, the underlying thing is that the relationship with Indonesia is schizophrenic. It's bipolar. We have this really close government-to-government relationship. I agree with Dewi about that, and I agree that it's closer now than it was in the so-called heyday of Keating, because that was at a limited level. But government-to-government, and even institutionally, it's very strong. But then, beyond that, it's extraordinarily weak. And this is one of the sources of tensions in the relationship, this gap between public ignorance, and it is ignorance about Australia, and that high-level relationship. And eventually that's going to cause tensions, and that's why the relationship remains fragile despite that depth of contact.
What kind of tensions when you say that? I mean, we heard Kevin Rudd talking about conflict at sea, confrontasi over boat people, but what are you talking about when you say tensions?
Because most Australians didn't notice the democratisation of Indonesia, haven't been aware that it's become this multi-party, democratic, liberal, open society with I was going to say a free media, I'd actually say a feral media, along with Australia, probably the freest media in the whole of East Asia. And this is an entirely new society to the caricatures. I think the President called it preposterous caricatures that dominated in Australian perception under Suharto. But one of the reasons why this is happening and why it's actually getting worse, as the Lowy polls and all the other polling, all sorts of other polls from Crosby, Textor and others all show it's getting much worse while the government-to-government relationship is getting better, is that Indonesian language is not diminishing. It's actually, somebody said recently, in cardiac arrest. It's almost gone. We have figures which I can't resist quoting, which is 1972, 1,190 kids at year 12 in Australia, 1972, doing Indonesian, 2010, less than that. And that's despite the population increasing by 30% in that time. So we've actually fallen since the 70s when the White Australia policy was around. So, and this is because of a sort of perfect storm that's occurred, universities contracting and cutting small enrolments, but this endless parade of terrible news stories from Indonesia, bombings, disease, the tsunami, earthquakes. It's this image of terrorism and threat, which means that people don't want their kids studying it. And what's happening is we're at the point now, within about 5 years, Indonesian language will vanish completely from our schools. By 2020, we'll probably have only a couple of universities left in Melbourne and Darwin on current trends as they stand, still teaching Indonesian. So Indonesian is almost gone. And how are we going to handle a relationship with a country that Moody's and Standard & Poor's all say is going to be one of the top 5 economies in the world by 2050, when the US isn't there? Imagine what Southeast Asia is going to be like then. How are we going to do that if no one can speak Bahasa Indonesia?
I'm just going to pause our other panellists. So we go to our next question, which is again on this subject. It's from Marcus Wicken.
Yeah, as we've just been hearing, many Australians do think about Indonesians in a very generalised way and about the country in a very generalised way. And my own experience here actually illustrates that, because I've often had experiences here, living here, that have undermined assumptions about the country I didn't even realise I had. But I've also found it's a two-way street, and I was interested to hear some of the panel identify some salient beliefs about Australia, accurate or not, that they think are particularly common in wider Indonesian society.
Okay, let's start with Rafendi. Do you think there are broad beliefs? We're talking about misunderstandings about Indonesia, but let's put the shoe on the other foot now. Right. Do Indonesians have misunderstandings or perceptions about Australia that are dangerous, if you say, for the relationship?
I like the notion of 3 Bs, go beyond beef, boats, and Bali. I like that, As if the relationship is only about that 3 Bs. And stereotypes is still playing around. And stereotypes is strengthened in Australia by the fact about ignorance, the fact about education, on the culture, on language, and the fact about ignorance about the last 15 years. For 15 years, there has been so many changes in Indonesia that Indonesia becoming democracy, it was not even known, by the 33% according to the survey. And the stereotype from Indonesian side is actually much more decreasing in the last 15 years. Before, it was very much strong. Well, this is white countries. It's white countries. It is not part of Asia. And they are always representing the Western interests. And they always want to divide Indonesia into pieces, right? The East or West Papua.
They still do that.
Some of them, yeah.
We'll come to that particular issue later, but yeah.
So that stereotypes is still strong, but it's decreasing. But it is more Indonesia getting more interested to Australia rather than the Australian interested to Australia.
Yeah, Yuli, President Boediono, when he addressed the Australian Parliament, said quite candidly, you'd have to say, that some Indonesians remain afflicted with Australia-phobia. Do you think that's correct?
Yeah. I think I would tend to disagree with Rafendi, because even though Indonesians think that a Western education is important and it's too expensive to send them to the US or Europe, you notice they send 17,000 every year go to study in Australia. Yet if Indonesians have money, they don't go to Australia as tourists or visits. They go to the USA, Hollywood, Disneyland, and they go to London and Europe.
We're a service provider, that's all we're.
Yeah, but they don't, you know.
They should have Disneyland.
They should have. Somebody says because Australia is boring. No way, Australia is very strict to those who have been there. I don't know, maybe Australia needs to promote itself, that it's an interesting, exciting country. Maybe we'll have a Bali in Australia, and then Indonesians will go there.
Well, we do. It's called the Gold Coast. But I'll just move on to Yenny. Yenny, what's your view about Indonesian perceptions of Australia? Are there misperceptions? I mean, the white Australia policy, obviously, a lot of people still think the country is a white country. It obviously isn't. It's a multicultural country.
Yeah, I think when I asked my driver on the way here, just to get a glimpse of what laymen think of Australia, I asked him, so what do you think of when you hear the word Australian? What do you think? He said, oh, it's just white men. Exactly, And
unfortunately, you have one on the panel, so or two, in fact. So that didn't help.
That didn't help, exactly. But also, I think our relationship with Australia is pretty much clouded by the East Timor incident. Again, I would like to go back to that because I think Indonesia still fears that Australia has a bigger agenda when it comes to our territorial integrity. That Indonesia doesn't like, Australia doesn't like a strong Indonesia, and that it will do whatever it takes, intelligent-wise, to undermine our unity. So there is that sense of suspicion as well, especially amongst the people related to the military, or even some laymen.
Yenny, that is an important issue, and we are definitely coming to it later. So I'll hold you there, and we'll go to another question. You're watching Q&A live from Jakarta. Our next question is from Nicholas Hughes.
Indonesia's annoyance at Australia's suspension of the live cattle trade has led to Indonesia implementing a policy of self-sufficiency in beef production. In my view, this policy is clearly unsustainable, as we're seeing with rising beef prices and reportedly farmers selling their breeding stock for slaughter. Australian investment in Indonesia's domestic cattle industry would be problematic. A better business model could be for Indonesians to invest in cattle stations in the top end of Australia. How can we encourage politicians in both Australia and Indonesia to focus on longer-term trade and investment relationships?
Dewi, can I start with you? And we just reflect on the fact that the Indonesian ambassador to Australia has been travelling around the north to cattle stations in recent days, and there's great hope starting to slowly unfold that there may be some end to this impasse over the live cattle trade. Do you think there will be?
Well, I'm always afraid that I'll be asked about the beef, although I'm not an expert about that. The beef issue is very sensitive in Indonesia at the moment, as you know, but it's more a corruption issue rather than this embargo. Though I realize, and as a consumer, as a housewife, we're all very complaining about the high price of Indonesian beef now. It's as if we are all eating Wagyu. Rendang is getting to be the most costly food in the world. But the questions about import is, as you know, very sensitive in Indonesia. It is always a debate about whether it's food security or food sovereignty. One could argue that we should be talking about food security in which an element of greater self-reliance is important, because for a country as big as Indonesia, it is also not very wise to be totally dependent on outsiders, which could be affected by problems of trade, foreign exchange, and other disruptions. So Indonesia needs also to be able to grow its own food as much as possible. But of course, the shortfall should be made based on import to ensure that the right of the consumers, the food security is ensured. So in terms of national policy, the desire to develop an Indonesian beef industry, to grow our own live cattle, is important. And Indonesia is big enough. The eastern part of Indonesia has, I think, sufficient land where we can grow the cattle. And here we hope that we can have a win-win solution with Australia.
So just on this issue, though, very briefly, do you think we'll see a resolution to this issue? The quotas were cut hugely after the suspension of trade by the Australian government. And that was a pretext, in a way, for certain people in your agricultural ministry to move into this self-sufficiency area. But do you think it'll come back again?
You know, this is tongue-in-cheek. Very few people think about policy in Ministry of Agriculture at the moment. So they have other interesting things happening there. So I don't hold your breath that any decisive policy would be taken.
Okay, I'm just going to see a lot of Australians will
with that.
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't think it's realistic for Indonesia to be self-sufficient in terms of our beef production in the near future. So we have to find a solution that will be beneficial for both countries. I think given the geographical conditions of Indonesia, it's much costly to raise cattle here than in Australia, for example, because you have to feed the cattle here. Well, whereas in Australia, you can just let them loose, you know, in all these plains. So, just like Australians in Bali, you know, you let them loose. So, I think the best ways, I mean, the issue is more than just beef, but it's also about national pride. You know, self-sufficiency is about national pride. It's about food security issues and all that. So why don't we just take the approach of building a Toyota of beef? You know, it's a Japanese import, it's Japanese production, but it's a production line is everywhere in so many different countries, but it's still a Japanese company.
Well, I think that does get to the point the questioner was saying, that perhaps investment from Indonesia in the Northern Territory and other parts of Australia might work. But I'm just going to go to Tim. This is slightly mysterious, I'm sure, for a lot of Australians, what we were talking about with the Agriculture Department, what Dewi was saying. But of course, what we know is the Agriculture Department is under the control of one party, an Islamist party, the PKS, a very large party with very few members in the actual parliament. How did that happen, and how does that change the equation?
Well, that ministry has been really used, and this has become quite clear in a major corruption scandal in Indonesia, as a money-raising exercise where essentially beef quotas are being auctioned off for corrupt benefit, and this has led to a series of trials that are absolutely front page in Indonesian newspapers the way Australian issues never are. So this party, PKS, which was an electoral wonder child at the last elections, has since experienced a whole range of corruption scandals, including the beef about beef, and it's now polling at around less than 3%. So it's pretty much destroyed itself over this issue. That's what the in-jokes tonight have been about. So the problem for Australia in dealing with this is that what we see as essentially a domestic issue about animal cruelty is, in the Indonesian context, about some very difficult issues about politics, about how corruption operates within ministries, and of course, most importantly, the forthcoming elections next year, with the first presidential election in July, second round in September. So there's going to be this huge changeover of power, and what's been going on with these parties has an impact on the beef policy with Australia, but we don't see it that way.
Yeah, I'm going to cut you there because you've forecast what's in our next question. So you're watching a special edition of Q&A live in Jakarta. Audience is 50% Indonesian, 50% Australian. Our next question is from Savitra Boediono.
How can the government of Indonesia address corruption given that there is little incentive to do so? Public officials are unsatisfied with their salaries, and international development assistance does face its challenges in the area. So what strategy would be the best to address these problems and find a solution given
Dimas.
this climate?
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Thank you. Dimas.
What a difficult question to me.
You can solve Indonesia's biggest problem in
Easier
one
to
minute.
answer something about beef, I think. First of all, salaries are not the issue. If we talk about salaries, you know, it'll be never-ending. I remember a story once in which the president wanted to raise civil servant salaries to the chagrin of another minister, and the president said, look, if you pay them peanuts, you'll get monkeys. And the response from the minister says, yeah, but what happens if you already have monkeys working for you? So it is not about salaries. It is about a system which we only realized in the last few years, which was so embedded within our culture, which was so systemic, that it is taking probably a generation to weed out. And I think the front runners in this battle against corruption is the private sector, it is NGOs, civil society, and it is the press, of continuously exposing these transgressions that occur. And slowly, but hopefully, surely, I'm not there now, but slowly, we are getting results. The second thing that needs to happen is, look, we have no one to look up to, because within our political elite, at all levels, someone is tied to a corruption case. So it becomes a norm. And the saddest part about that is our next generation of Indonesians who are only learning this democratic system and saying, hey, is this the normal practice? When you have someone who's 30-year-old, only working for a few years and has billions and billions of rupiah stashed away somewhere, it becomes a normal culture. So I think the next election, hopefully for us, is just to get someone who we know is clean. Doesn't have to be the best president in the world, doesn't have to necessarily to be the best manager. We'd like to, and a clear decision maker, but he has some moral authority. And I think that is what's lacking in Indonesian society today.
Okay, I want to hear from Yuli now, because your magazine, Tempo, we have a program in Australia on the ABC called Four Corners, which investigates quite often corruption. And this is what Tempo seems to do. You've got 6 or 7 investigative journalists, and you've actually put yourself on the front line of this debate. Tell us how you've done that and how important it is.
Well, it has been our mission to expose as much as possible all acts of corruption. Now, sometimes it gets so tiring because we expose one act of corruption after another, and there doesn't seem to be any point in it because they're still being repeated again and again. But like Dimas said, we're not going to stop. We want to shame them. And it's working. The KPK, the Anti-Graft Commission, is slowly doing its job. The problem here is that the rule of law was never really a strong point ever since we started with our democracy. You know, it needs to be, there's something missing. And I think that we're talking here about a certain mindset, leadership, the system of education that we've had. You know, all of this we're still in the process. We're still in how do you call it, in transition, you know? We're still going towards. And I believe that in time, maybe not in the next generation, but the other generation, that, you know, we will learn in time. We have to hope. And there has been, besides also answering Dimas, to exposing corruption, which we do every week, really.
And sometimes to your cost. I mean, you've been firebombed, you've had editions of the magazine stopped in the streets by police and taken off newsstands.
That's right. When we exposed the corruption of the police bought all the copies. All the copies. It helped us. When we reprinted, they bought it all up again. And finally, one enterprising vendor in the street started making copies, photocopies. That sold. So we should really be doing more of those kind of things. But especially when it does.
All right, now in the interest of getting to quite a few different subjects, with the time we have left, we're going to go to Dylan de Los Angeles.
Thank you, Tony. My question's for Ibu Dewi in particular. Ibu, Indonesians are often concerned that Australia is supporting separatism in places like Papua. However, many Australians simply believe that peaceful activism, even about controversial topics such as separatism, should not be punished. In many European democracies, such as Spain and Belgium, the separatist parties are part of the political mainstream. Another example is the referendum next year for Scotland's independence from the UK. And my question is this. Indonesia wants to be a modern democracy, but why is Indonesia so sensitive about separatism? Thank you.
Dewi.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important question. And I think it is a reflection that Indonesia has always been very, very vulnerable in terms of its national unity. Indonesia is still in a state of being, both in terms of trying to create one nation out of this multivarious ethnic groups and so on, and also trying to develop into one territory, because we have over 17,000 islands with very, very poor interconnectivity. So the state itself is still in the state of being also. So Indonesia has always been challenged from within. We have separatist movements ever since, our early days of independence. So trying to keep the country together is a full-time job, and most Indonesians are still very, very concerned about national unity.
Can I just bring you to the Australian side of this? Why is it there's such a deep suspicion of the Australian government's motives on this when the Australian government has signed the Lombok Treaty, which recognises absolutely that the Papua, and Papua are parts of Indonesia?
It's not just Australia. Most of the countries in the world have recognized and always, in fact, affirm their support for Indonesian territorial integrity. But the fact of the matter is that in many, many countries, there are also groups which are actively supporting separatist movements in Papua. And Australia becomes a special case here because in the late 50s and early 60s, it was known that Australia actually supported the separation of Papua, the Irian, from Indonesia then. And there are still long memories here of that. In fact, there was a suggestion that maybe during the Menzies period that Australia could buy Papua. Secondly, during the East Timor period conflict, it was most Indonesians still blame Australia, and particularly within the military, but also within our intellectual community, that the independence of East Timor is in fact strongly supported by Australia. So that suspicions are still there.
Okay, I'm going to bring in another question on this subject. It's actually from a Papuan. It's from Panellists, Lockbear.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like, elaborating my question. As the government of Indonesian and sit down access to the international media and the United Nations Special Rapporteur to enter West Papua. Is the Indonesian state trying to isolate West Papua?
Yeah, okay, so why has the government of Indonesia shut down access to the international media and to the United Nations Special Rapporteur to enter West Papua? And I'll start with Rafendi.
Well, I like to go back to this notion of why Indonesia is so sensitive on the word separatist, right? The explanation from Ibu Dewi probably goes back to the 50 years. But I'd like to go back only the last 15 and then 30 years of authoritarian regime that applied a security approach with a very harsh way in maintaining the unity. So it's a question of legacy. When it comes to a legacy of a previous one, it becomes a mindset. It becomes a mindset which is believed not only by the military who are in the front line, but also among the bureaucracy and among the mainstream politicians. So then it becomes a challenge to really change this mindset. What's wrong about separatists? As long as it is an idea, right? That is the example it was given by the question. So it takes time to change this mindset.
Can I ask you this? Does the media blockout make things worse? Does it make other countries suspicious about what's going on?
And then this is 15 years already of change, right? Actually, if I'm running the country, I would just allow the media to come to West Papua. It's not an issue. And the fact that Special Rapporteur was not going there, it is still under negotiation. I think my friend Pennias is referring to the plan that Indonesia is inviting the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression. There has been a very difficult negotiations on how the modality to come to Indonesia, because there is also some tendency from some part of the international committee too much also focusing on the issue. Well, actually, the issue of freedom of expression is the whole issue of Indonesia as a whole. Although we have problems as well, particularly in West Papua, in terms of freedom of expression. Even hoisting flags. For me, hoisting flags is an expression of a peaceful way. Why should it be so harsh and people get sentenced jail because of hoisting flags?
Let me bring in Yuli, and once again, I'll get you to focus, if you can, on the Australian angle of this, because there was when President Obama announced in the Australian Parliament that US Marines were going to be based in Darwin, there was deep suspicion in Indonesia, in some quarters, that was about possibly getting West Papua back militarily.
There you go. I would like to talk to mention one thing that I feel there's a bias here in Australia about the Papua thing. You call it West Papua. There's two Papuans in Papua. There's a Papua province and the West Papua province. So when you say West Papua, which one are you talking about? And let me tell you that in West Papua, the OPM are not as active as in Papua. So that's the irony of it. I am for the press, anyone going inside Papua so that, and West Papua, so that people can see some of the things that are going on. There's still a lot to do in Papua. The government is lagging behind. People are not, the kids are not getting into schools. There's a lot to be done. Yes, but there's also a lot being done, and that's not being shown. If the government was confident enough, they should let it be. Now, I'm told that why the rapporteur and foreign media are not allowed in, because then the separatists will give it a reason to do something and create problems. I don't know, but I am all for Papua being opened up so that people can see for themselves the good that's being done.
I mean, this is not a defense, but just as a way of looking at it, understanding the Indonesian psyche. You have to remember that we've only really secured Indonesian borders for less than 30 years, 40 years or so. And our history has always been about being divided by foreign Western countries and powers for 350 years. So there's always...
Does that account for the suspicion about the US Marines in Darwin?
I think there's always an inherent fear being taught at the age of our children. Our children are being taught about the unitary state as we speak, and being taught about Indonesian history and about foreign colonial powers, always separating and dividing Indonesia. So that sinks into the Indonesian psyche and why we look at things and foreign powers as a way of separating. That's how we conduct our foreign policy, is about how do we manage ourselves. That is not a defense, but that's trying to understand the Indonesian psyche. The other part, again, is not a defense, but I agree that Papua should be opened up. But if you look at the actual number of requests of media going into Papua, I think over the last 5 years, as far as I know, 90% plus have been approved.
Yes.
All the foreign media that wanted to go to Papua have been approved. And those 5% or even less that did not get approved was usually because they had administrative issues with regard with their permission. So it's not a defense, but just putting...
But before you come in, Dewi, I'm just going to go to another question from Binsar Manuran. Binsar Manuran. Up over there. There we go.
Yes, on this issue, I'd just like to step back with a bigger perspective and ask, is Bhinneka Tunggal Ika an impossible dream? Is Indonesia too diverse? The former Yugoslavia is a clear example of a nation failing because its national borders didn't reflect the true aspirations of its various people. Nobody can doubt strength in unity. But how can a country truly progress if the foundation is based on inevitable political compromising and no one true common goal? Could the panelists give their opinion on what one issue could actually unite all Indonesians?
Let's start with Yenny on that.
Yeah, I mean, the notion of Indonesia, some debate that it's not really, it's a notion that is created, out of nothing, conjured up by some historians and then created to be Indonesia. But, we are very diverse culturally and different people, people in Java and people in Papua look very different and talk very differently. But, I think Bhinneka Tunggal Ika is still viable and it's will remain.
Could you explain to an Australian audience what that means?
It's a unity in the diversity. It's our national motto. It's what unites us together, and that's the basis of our principles of this nation. And it has been there has been criticism that there are some attacks on it. You know, some people have been finding ways or acting in ways that would disunite this unity. And but I think it will remain as our principle, sort of basic principles of this country. And apart from the Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, we also have many factors that unite us. You know, for example, the Bahasa. I mean, without Bahasa, we will not be able to communicate with one another. The people in Papua, for example, they consist of so many different tribes and so many different languages. There are more than 300 spoken languages and dialects in Indonesia. So without Bahasa, they wouldn't be able to communicate with one another. But it takes more than just talking about it also, of course. It takes for Indonesians to really adhere to that principle. And that is our real challenge.
Dewi, we've just got a brief time because we are running out of time. I'd like to get to one or two other questions. But your view on that, is there one common goal, one common thread?
I'm beginning to be very optimistic about Indonesia. I've always been very optimistic. But I remember in 1998, 1999, when Indonesia was during this very, very difficult crisis, many people believed from outside the former Soviet Union, like Yugoslavia, and especially with separatist movements in Aceh and Papua at the time, and Jakarta seems to be really, you know, imploding with violence everywhere. But I was a strong believer then, in the eye of the storm, because I was in the office of President Habibie, that Indonesia came about out of a dream, the dream of an imagined community of these people with diversity, but within a unity, that we want to achieve happiness together, prosperity together, security together, and that we were not united by the military. The military came about later, but the idea of Indonesia was very, very strong. It preceded the idea of the Indonesian state. So because of that dream, I think that we continue to survive together, although it will continue to be challenged. And I don't think we should take unity for granted. After all, the Roman Empire still broke up after 1,000 years and over. So I don't think we can take any unity for granted.
Here's a question. I'm going to just jump in because we really have to get through our last two questions quickly. And this is one from, and it will require translation, but it's from Eka Ernawati.
Ya, terima kasih. Ditranslate. Dari tadi kita membicarakan tentang demokrasi, yang dimana katanya Indonesia adalah merupakan demokrasi terbesar, dan tapi pelanggaran HAM masih di mana-mana. Tadi membicarakan tentang korupsi yang terus merajalela, yang saya rasa nggak bisa dihapus karena semua terlibat korupsi.
Okay, we'll go for our translation. Thank you very much.
There are still many human rights abuses in Indonesia, and corruption is a big problem.
Pertanyaan saya adalah, Prabowo adalah salah satu calon kandidat Presiden Republik Indonesia. Sedangkan Prabowo adalah salah satu orang yang melakukan pelanggaran HAM terberat yang sudah diakui secara internasional, dan Prabowo sendiri sudah mengakuinya.
Thank you. We better go to our translator again there. Sorry.
Prabowo Subianto is a candidate for election as president in the elections coming up next year. But he is suspected of involvement in the human rights abuses in Trisakti in 1998.
Okay, we might get you to wind up your question quickly. Go ahead.
Pertanyaan saya adalah, bagaimana hubungan internasional Australia dan Indonesia seandainya nanti Prabowo menjadi Presiden Republik Indonesia?
That's the question we'd like to ask.
Okay, now for our audience in Australia, we better get the translation of the final bit. Go.
How will this affect relations between Australia and Indonesia if in the future Prabowo becomes the president of Indonesia?
Okay, well, Tim Lindsey, I'll just start with you, and we'll keep our answers brief. It's hard because Prabowo is quite a notorious figure in the world.
Prabowo is a cashiered general who was thrown out of the army for his involvement in human rights abuses in 1998.
And he's a strong candidate for
and a former son-in-law of President Suharto. So, you know, we've got a zombie prime minister in Australia back from the dead. Prabowo's got a hope too, I would have thought, in Indonesia. he at the moment is one of the most popular candidates. I think he's been polling right up the top of all the candidates. There's the possibility the current mayor of Jakarta, if he runs, might be the only person who could beat Prabowo. So the US has refused Prabowo a visa entry on human rights issues. If he becomes president, look, it's going to be a serious problem for Indonesia's image right around the world internationally, and it will be read by many as a return to nationalist, military-oriented past. Now, whether the system allows that to happen, whether he's elected is one question. The second question is whether the democratic process that's been put in place would contain and control such a leader in Indonesia. Maybe it could, but it certainly would cause significant international problems.
Okay, brief answers all around. Rafendi.
Yes, indeed. Whoever the president is, even Prabowo become a president, there's something you cannot stop. That's the lay down, the foundation of democracy is already there. That means even Prabowo will have to deal with this. They will have to deal with the forces of the civil society, with the forces of a vibrant media, with the forces of all kind of parameters of democracy. If he's trying to stop it, he will go down.
Yuli, you heard the sort of frisson of laughter, and I would say uncomfortable laughter when the name was mentioned, but it's a real possibility that he could be president.
No, I have faith in the Indonesian constituency. Let's have the elections, and I'm willing to bet money that he's not going to make it.
Yenny.
Well, you know, I go down to the grassroots very often, and I would testify that Prabowo is an immensely popular figure. That what Tim said was right. That the only one who can beat him is the mayor, is the governor of Jakarta. But if he's not running, then Prabowo would certainly win the election. There are attempts by many political parties to try to block him from running because his party will not be able to get the 20%. I think from today's polling suggests that, that he will not be able to get the 20% votings necessary for him to get nominated. Okay. But if he does, or if he can call up a coalition together, then he might be the primary contender.
I'll just hear from Dewi on this briefly, because we've really got time for one last question after this, and we need to move on to it.
I think it will be a major challenge in both within Indonesia and also Indonesia's relations with many, many countries. But this is then, you know, a major question in democracy. Democracy do not always yield the best results. So anything can happen, because in a democracy, it is not the best that gets elected, but the most popular. And as Yenny said, you know, the view of sophisticated urbanites are sometimes quite different from the views from people in the rural area. So, but on the other hand, the question remains that Indonesia is only going to become stronger, hopefully. And Indonesia is already a member of the G20, and it's a member of many, many international organizations.
Dewi, you're almost forecasting our last question, so I'll interrupt you. We've got time for this one last question. It comes from Elisa Pedrana.
It is predicted that by 2030, Indonesia will have the 10th largest economy in the world. Who will be their allies as they rise to a new superstatus power? Will it be their regional neighbours, Australia and other Southeast Asian countries, or the Muslim brothers in Malaysia and the Middle East?
Dimas.
Who will be our ally?
Who will you be closest to in the future?
Who are we allied to now?
Well, if you leave it to SBY, we'll have zero enemies. But I think whether now or then, 2015, 2050, I think our allies, and by our primary allies, will be countries which we share common values with. You know, economic development only goes so far. And that's why I think we should look at Indonesia-Australia relations in a positive manner, because I think we're going from the same starting point now, which is we are both democracies. We respect human rights and civil rights. It's not perfect, but we look at it the same way. There's a long way to go. So I think it will still be that. Those countries with common values with Indonesia.
Okay, we're in danger of losing our satellite. Tim, a brief answer.
I think Indonesia and Australia are not yet fully aware that they're actually natural partners in this new world that's emerging with the rise of China and the US. We'll both end up being countries that aren't entirely committed to either of those, but which need both of them. We're both going to be democracies, we're both going to be open liberal societies, we've both got problems. We're actually natural strategic partners, and we're going to be forced into this partnership, whether we like it or not, so we should try and do it well and quick.
I think that's actually a good time, a good place for us to leave it. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel. Yenny, Wahid, Dimas, Dewi, Fortuna, Anwar, Yuli, Ismartono, Rafendi, Djamin and Tim Lindsey. Thank you. Thank you very much. And a very special thanks to our wonderful audience here in Jakarta and our partners at Metro TV News and ABC International. Please give yourself a quick round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much. Have to get in before the satellite leaves. Next Monday night, we're back in Australia with the new Deputy Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, Coalition frontbencher Malcolm Turnbull, writer and comedian Corinne Grant, the Australians cartoonist Bill Leak and policy analyst Miriam Lyons. Until then, selamat malam dan sampai jumpa.